Afternoon. I'm coming to you from the Six Nations Confederacy of the Haudenosaunee, specifically the Seneca Nation, which some people know as Buffalo City in New York. Professor Tate, thank you and the Anti-Racism Center for inviting me to um, give this talk. I'm gonna get right into it. Um, but I guess I'll say one thing up front. It's a talk that kind of maps a quixotic kind of personal history relationship to Black studies in Canada. So I'll get right into it. In 1969, the Barbadian-born Black Canadian writer Austin Clarke found himself at Yale University in the thick of the Black activist movement sweeping the USA, and more specifically, the call for the institutionalization of Black studies, Clarke studies. Clarke would find himself as visiting professor and writer teaching Black studies courses to some of the field's present luminaries, for example, Henry Louis Gates Jr., who was an undergraduate then. This anecdote serves as a kind of orienting cautionary tale of how we might how we might date Black studies in Canada. In a strange twist of events, one might say that Black studies in Canada began with Clarke's forays at Yale and even at the University of Texas at Austin as well, where he was in the late 1960s and early 1970s. Clarke's participation in the founding of institutionalized Black studies in the USA is an important part of the diasporic character of Black studies and from its earliest inception. Indeed, the diasporic foundation of Black studies is often concealed in service of more nationally bound histories as one understands the seduction of those bounded histories when Black studies is deployed as a means towards national inclusion. That Black studies did not officially take hold in Canada in the late 1960s and 1970s tells us a story of the Canadian nation state and its relationship to Blackness too. It might be important to note that the long delay towards Black studies in Canada is symptomatic of the deeper denial and malaise towards Black people and Blackness as constitutive of Canada and Canadianness. It's in part this relation to Blackness that this paper explores through a symptomatic reading of some moments that might be instructive for a Black Studies project in Canada that is not reduced to a diversity and inclusion project. Black Studies in Canada is at a critical interregnum, lodged between the founding of the field now more than 50 years ago in the USA and the very public May 2020 murder of George Floyd. Floyd's death helped to produce a renewed impetus to make Black studies in Canada emerge in its current institutional forms. In what follows, I attempt a conjunctural reading of the time before and after George Floyd, as a way to work past a certain kind of assumptive logic about what, how, when, and where Black studies in Canada might find its most salient and intellectual authorization. More than 50 years after Black studies entered the institution of the university in the USA, Black studies is now entering the Canadian Academy in a formal way. Of course, Black studies has always been in and on Canadian campuses since the late 1960s, and in even more organized form, if not recognized, from the mid-1970s and onwards. The distinction that we must make is that Black studies in Canada, until recently, had no institutional home. As I have said repeatedly, Black studies has had to be smuggled into the Canadian Academy continually. Nonetheless, the smuggling was not always on the ground. It was sometimes quite explicit. In 1995, I applied for a tenure-stream academic position at York University, advertised with a heading that asked for a specialist in, quote, Black North American Studies, or Latino studies in North America. The advertisement was explicit in its call for Black studies. It was not a fugitive call. Indeed, this call could only be as explicit as it was because people like Russell Chase, Jerry Ginsburg, David Trotman, Ato Sekioto, and Leslie Sanders were already doing Black studies at York University under the rubric of other names. I then taught Black Studies courses from 1995 to 2001 when I left York for the University of Toronto. So the idea that Black Studies is new in the institution is one that is subtended by a history that has not yet, as far as I know, been officially written down. Indeed, my undergraduate years were a series of courses that perused the Black worlds of Africa, the Caribbean, South and Central America, and North America, with stops in Black Britain. These courses largely, but not exclusively, taught in the interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary departments of Humanities Division and Social Science Division, as they were then named at York, function as an unofficial Black Studies education. And while no one called it Black Studies then as a proper name, we were fully aware we were studying Africa and its diaspora. Of course, Caribbean and Latin American studies and African studies as official programs existed and were well established at the time of my undergraduate studies in the mid-1980s, and some of those courses I took were listed in those programs. By the time I was first hired at York again in 1995, Black Studies was more explicit, if not officially named as a program. Leslie Sanders, in particular, would have supervised a number of undergraduates, master's, and doctoral students in Black Studies projects by that time. And it is true that in the absence of Black Studies in Canada at the official institutional level, that Black Studies also retain an important presence in Saturday schools, community meeting places, especially those where politics was heatedly debated and post-colonial desires plotted, and in other extra academic spaces where Black people shared knowledge about our lives. For me, it was the Third World Books and Crafts on Bathurst Street in Toronto, a place I have ambivalent and sentimental memories of, which made Black studies an urgent political reality for me. I begin with the personal and will likely bounce back and forth to it as a way to say something about the manner in which Black studies produces an intellectual life that is worth considering. An intellectual life that is buttressed by a profound sense that knowledge and its making is an essential element of and for producing a just world, if such a world is even possible. I hold no degrees that say I study Black studies, and none of the institutions that I attended had Black studies programs at the time that I studied there. Yet, my legitimacy as a Black studies scholar has never been in doubt or questioned. And furthermore, I have not always since 1995 named myself a Black studies scholar. Why is this? The question of legibility in the Canadian Academy is acute in this regard. As a graduate student, I first named myself as an anti-racism studies until I recognized the limits of that paradigm for fully studying Black life in Canada. I then turned to cultural studies as a signifier because it was the designation where I could find critical scholarship and scholars whose intellectual questions seemed to meet some of my own. Later, I adjusted it to Black diaspora studies, critical Canadian studies, multicultural studies, and after reading and thinking deeply with Black British scholars, I later settled on Black diaspora cultural studies, sometimes adding social justice, like when I had a Canada Research Chair of Cultural Studies and Social Justice. All of these names serve to smuggle what I actually did into the Canadian Academy and to make it legible to the academic scene there. The study of Black Canadian life, as that study might help work to unravel the profound consequences of the entire structure of the post-Columbus world. As you can see, my education and maturity as a Black studies scholar was one achieved against the absence of institutionality. In the initial moments of my study, Despite what I read, what I was taught, and the scholars who at the time were fundamentally rearranging the humanities and social sciences, which were largely Black studies scholars, in deeply profound ways, Black studies was still largely felt to be a paradigm of study wholly associated with the USA. In fact, while researchers like Peggy Bristow were for years prior uncovering the history of Black Ontario as a research officer at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, where I did my graduate work, and in the days when you could have researchers in institutions who were not teachers, who simply did research, that long lost time. So Peggy Bristow was doing that work on Black Ontario, or Leslie Sanders had been teaching Black writers since the 1970s. Similarly for Jerry Ginsburg, American History, or Russell Chase, the Black diaspora literature and criticism, or David Trotman teaching Caribbean and Afro-Caribbean permutations and the Black diaspora as example, the language of Black studies in Canada remain almost incoherent. My quixotic account here does not even begin to account for the multiple histories that took Black life in Canada as the theme of their work. For instance, I think of the historians Robin Winks and Jim Walker as examples. What is this Black studies that I'm speaking of? For me, Black studies is less the field and more a project. It is an intellectual project concerned with liberation. Because liberation is central to Black studies, then not every study of Black people amounts to Black studies. Black studies is not disciplinarily bound, and Black studies is not an instrument to reform the already established and profoundly anti-Black disciplines. Black studies is not an inclusion and diversifying tool. Black studies, like cultural studies in its best formulation, is an anti-disciplinary, libertarian project concerned to overthrow the Eurocentric order of knowledge that currently governs our globe. Black study is more than the study of Black populations. It is instead a challenge to what we think we know about Black people. And therefore, Black studies calls into question the entire Euro-American view of the world that presently organizes most of global life. The very best Black studies calls the Euro-American view of the world into disrepute. As a radical reorientation to knowledge, knowing, and meaning, Black studies then seeks to re-narrate and reinvent the world anew, not from the desire for Black domination, but towards a world without forms of domination. As you can intone, then, Black studies has a profound critique of the university as an institution too, and how the university's legitimacy is deployed in the larger world. In this sense, then, Black studies is a movement or a project, as the African American political theorist Michael Hanchard taught me years ago. Sylvia Winter, writing of how Black studies made its immediate push on the university, summed it up this way. And before I quote her directly, she's referencing the murder of Martin Luther King. So I quote from her the three movements that she believes made Black studies. All three movements have been moved to action by the 1968 murder of Martin Luther King Jr. and by the toll of burning in the cities and angry riots that followed in its wake. These events were particularly decisive for the Black Studies movement. The new willingness of mainstream university administrators to accede to the students' activist demands for the setting of Black Studies programs and department was made possible by the trauma that gripped the nation. And what she means by that trauma is the assassination of Martin Luther King, the assassination of Malcolm X, and the response to it that ignited U.S. cities. She says Black studies entered the institution because of that trauma, sorry. Indeed, I would argue that the unfolding of Black studies in contemporary Canada is also due in part to another trauma that gripped people around the world in 2020. That trauma of our time was the brutal public murder of George Floyd. If the official establishment of Black studies finds its origin in the Floyd trauma, then it would be necessary that Black studies is not subordinated to the university as the site of a diversifying project. The George Floyd dividend, as I have dubbed it, has been, I believe, the underlying reason for the acceleration of Black studies in Canada. By dividend, I mean the rewards and profit, both material and affective, that have been gained for some individuals from Floyd's brutal and tragic public murder, and has resulted in institutions in Canada 50 years later finally finding something useful in officially endorsing Black studies as necessary to the life of the university. We should be cautious. The Floyd dividend, in its attempt to quell more radical calls for transformation, has resulted in the quick emergence of Black studies at a number of our institutions, at a number of Canadian institutions. Some institutions that have announced Black studies programs have been long in the making, like, for example, York University and Dalhousie University. Others have hired Black faculty and cluster hires, and yet others have brought together already existing faculty into programs and research clusters called Black Studies or Black Research Institutes and so on. Here I'm thinking about universities like Guelph and Windsor and others who have figured out other ways to make Black studies happen in the post-2020 moment. However, we must not confuse Black studies with equity, diversity, and inclusion initiatives. The two are not the same. Hiring more Black people does not mean you now have Black studies. While it is true that over the course of a career, a scholar might and will change the focus of their research and teaching, the quick move that many scholars made post-2020 to calling themselves from calling themselves anti-racist, social justice, and multiculturalists to now naming and calling themselves Black studies should be greeted with a healthy dose of skepticism. The argument I'm making here is not an argument about training. Indeed, while what and how you study is crucial to how you do Black studies, what is more important is positionality of knowledge in relationship to the disciplines and the undoing of the disciplines. If we are serious about Black studies, we don't seek to reform or transform the disciplines. We seek to give them back to themselves, unrecognizable, as Stuart Hall suggested the work of cultural studies was to do also some time ago. And this means that while Black studies departments yet to emerge in Canada, but programs and certificates and streams, might be housed in the university, if they replicate the form of the other departments and programs, then these Black studies formations will find it very difficult to do the work Black studies is meant to do, which is to produce an entirely new order of knowledge. In fact, I would argue that after 50 years of Black studies in the USA, that the neoliberal university has now realized that its disciplinary mechanisms can indeed discipline Black studies enough to make it conform to the conservative terrain that the university actually is. Thus, the emergence of Black studies in Canada is not a benevolent gift, but rather is in part, but not totally, a demobilizing gift. The betrayal of the Black Studies project or movement is to truncate it to the disciplinary mechanism of the university. By this, I mean that Black Studies' new official incorporation in the Canadian Academy can work to make less urgent a radical transformation of the academic institution itself and other institutions of our social arrangements. Because part of what happens is that the arrival of Black studies gets offered up as transformation in and of itself. But does it mean that we should reject this gift? No. But we must be clear about its limitations, and most importantly, we must be clear about how the university as an institution continually works against collectivity in service of producing individual recognition and reward. Such recognition and reward functions as a structure of legitimacy that individuals desire, but for which the scarcity of it is never enough to go around. In this way, then, incorporation into the university is a way to ration the distribution of what is claimed to be limited resources. This rationing is one way in which the keeping separate of forms of knowledge, as in the disciplines, is used to prevent forms of cohabitation that would otherwise work towards a significant block or for the overthrow of the institution. Because Black Studies is a project of liberation, a movement for liberation, It is a form of study that confronts the political arrangements of our lives. And if normative institutions seek to embrace it, we should be alert to the manner in which such appropriations take place so that we might keep ahead of the institution interrupting our movement towards liberation. The scholar Jeff Myers, in his recent book of Black Study, well, it's not so recent now, a couple of years ago, puts it this way. I quote from Myers. And so here Black studies means that tradition of refusal of the knowledge of the world as it is given to us by those committed to colonial and racial order, and all the ways we still experience it, the many othering practices it generated. It is refusal of the blessings of liberal humanism and its variants, the philosophy of life and living that is really only about the political same, a violent reanimation of the status quo, the Western conceptions of what has and should always be. It is in refusing that we created Black study as the places, in the margins, and contently so, that challenge everything the university handed down to us as the only possible reality. Black studies, then, as a project, is not a desire to be incorporated into the status quo, but to entirely transform it into other than itself. And what I'm offering you in my assessment here is an ambivalent perspective on what I call top-down Black studies, in which it is likely being deployed to interrupt what would likely be even more radical demands of the institution. And yet, my position is not one that simply argues for the refusal of Black studies entering the Canadian Academy. Rather, my position is one that wants to call attention to conditions, histories, and practices that are attendant to Black studies' arrival. One example we might look to is women's studies. 50 years plus of women's studies, founded around the same time as Black studies in the US, has now seen women's studies in Canada fully incorporated into the Canadian academic institution. The Social Sciences and Humanities Council has women's studies as an established research category. The same cannot be said for Black studies. In the context of SSHRC, Black studies remains fugitive and is still smuggled into the funded research space. This is not to say that SSHRC does not fund Black studies projects, I want to be clear, but rather that SSHRC lacks an explicit Black studies category, research subject matter category. Says quite a lot about Black studies in Canada 50 years after its founding. The affective and effective suppression of Blackness in Canada means that the incorporation of Black studies in Canada will be greeted with a kind of intellectual hiccup that will likely replicate the trauma that gave rise to it in its first place. And what I mean by that is, I think that many people who enter the Canadian Academy thinking that they're doing Black studies post 2020 are going to find themselves sometime down the road um, profoundly disappointed that what they're trying to do is illegible in many spaces, not in all spaces, but in many spaces. On the other hand, the Black Studies movement in Canada too will have to account for its own relation to the larger scholarly institution. In 2023, a friend sent me the call for papers for the Black Canadian Studies Association. The first word on the call stood out for me. It was NAH, N-A-H. The theme of the conference that year was titled NAH on the possibilities of ongoing refusals. The text of the CFP, um, the text of the CFP, in my view, had its own unconscious refusal. In 1994, the now iconic Maestro Fresh Rest left Canada, heading south to the USA to debut his rap album, citing, nah, this kid can't be from Canada. The album too was titled, nah, this kid can't be from Canada. And while Fresh West thought that that would have been his breakout album in the US, and it didn't happen. But what was important about that moment was that Fresh West could have titled that album, "Hey, this kid ain't from Canada." It would have been hokey, but it would have referenced a certain kind of Canadianness, a certain kind of white Canadianness. He didn't do that. And in thinking about that, it makes me think about Cardinal or Cardinal Official, song from 2001, Bacardi Slang, a song that would cement how important dialects and word revision is to Black Canadian identity. What drew my attention to the CFP, and I suspect the reason my friend sent it to me, was that the CFP citation did not cite any Black Canadians, not even the iconic Fresh West, nah. One thing that is important to note about the Black studies that takes the orientation of its knowledge seriously is that while it might eschew Euro-American claims, it is always fully aware of the local that it speaks from. The jettison of the local in that CFP was an interesting slippage to me. And my interest here is more about the slippage and less about the erasure, to be clear, right? I don't feel like they were necessarily erasing um Maestro Fresh Fest. They might not have even known of his song. But I'm interested in that slippage and why that slippage occurs. But let me be more pointed in my observation then, because I do believe that in what I call this new rush for Black studies in Canada, there's actually something at stake. Theorizing Black life from outside the USA is terrorizing Black life from outside the USA, not as an anti-American gesture, but as a mode of making sense of how similar practices land differently in different geographies, is crucial for a Black Studies project that seeks to produce a different order of knowledge and eventually another world. That is to puncture the world that we now have, so new modes of invention become possible. Black studies should be attuned to the geographies of its utterances. Black studies as a movement always has a geography. Its geography is always somehow wrapped up in the location of its practice. So while some Black Studies department will make claims about the nature of their formation, some claiming to be international, others nationally bound, others diasporic, and yet others centering Africa to jettison the place of their location in Black Studies, is always for me somehow suspect. And while the argument I am making is for a Black study that is conscious about the geography that it proceeds from, that Black studies is also always diasporic in its scope and its intentions. In this argument, geography is not a limit. Geography is what Stuart Hall would call the necessary modesty from where you begin as the important point of departure. A Black studies that does not nod to its nationally local geography is a Black studies that would argue that it's engaged in some kind of deception, some kind of political project that stalls at liberation, no matter how scholarly and theoretical fluent its grammarians might be. It's a Black studies that is more invested in the institution than invested in the communities that it should be seeking to be engaged in a liberation struggle with. So let me return to the Black Studies Association. Black Studies Association in its most recent history is an interesting case, the Black Canadian Studies, because it was made painfully aware of its geography. The tensions and activism of the BCSA, which engaged with the Federation of Humanities and Social Sciences, should work as a cautionary tale. The BCSA's actions of 2021, so right after George Floyd, still in COVID, threatened to open a significant and potentially reordering of Black life in the Canadian Academy if its rather modest demands could have been heard and acted on beyond a logic of shame and protest. In an article commenting on those events, one of the then co-presidents of the BCSA, Rosalind Hampton, detailed the history of the association's conversations and negotiations with the Federation. The initial negotiations began when a Black student was racially profiled at the 2019 Congress in Vancouver. Since 2019, the BCSA had canceled their conference twice, in part because they and the Federation were unable to agree on the conditions that would make their participation free of or lessen anti-Black encounters. So in 2021, when they withdrew again, several other organizations joined them, including one, University Press. What I thought we were actually witnessing in that moment is how Black studies as a movement, as an insurgent form of study, destabilizes white institutions. In this case, they were destabilizing the Federation. The Federation, I would argue, is a micro-presenting representation of the white nation of Canada. And in its counter with the BCSA, it began to unravel. When Black people make assertions within the context of white Canada, it begins to unravel. The struggle here then, or the struggle there then, was not one of inclusion, as the Federation's Equity, Diversity, Inclusion, Decolonization Committee suggested, but rather it was one of the very foundational theoretical or conceptual states of the organization, and by extension, what Canada is. The Black assertion could not be easily accepted as one that was valid, and thus the repression of Blackness that sits so firmly at the root of all that is Canada had to be expunged. Hampton has explored this repression that I'm making this claim about in her book, Black Racialization and Resistance at an Elite University, which is a study of McGill University. She notes that McGill is a founding institution of Canada even before Confederation. And the important point that she makes, and that I'm drawing on her to also make, is that the Federation is a subset of that particular kind of logic. So when that particular kind of white settler feeling and logic met Black resistance, it came to a confrontation. It could not but come to a confrontation. So let me return to this symptomatic reading of what Black studies might do in the Canadian context, that is both nationally and locally, and simultaneously beyond the geography of Canada. An important element of what I'm going to suggest is that as the field of Black studies takes hold in Canada, that the repressed anti-Blackness of the national white psyche will continue to reveal its violent orientation to Black people and Blackness more broadly defined. Now, I don't know if you're still with me or how much more time I have, but I'll give you some examples without reading the full paper. Here, I'm thinking about significant places in the Canadian landscape, like Nigger Rock in Quebec, the desecrated slave cemetery in Saint Armand. Or I'm thinking about the ongoing story of Marie Joseph Angelique. Or I'm thinking about the St. Lawrence Seaway and its history of trade all the way down into the Caribbean. Or I'm thinking about the Sir George Williams affair. These are all significant and important aspects of the kind of repressed notion of Blackness that lies at the heart of Canadian settler whiteness. I'm thinking about the East Coast, the Black miners of the East Coast. I'm thinking about salted cod. I'm thinking these are all examples, and these are examples that brings Canada firmly into the Atlantic slaveholding history that is often eschewed in Canada, as though Canada is outside of that history. Um, these things all haunt Canada. They're what Avery Gordon would call the ghostly presence of Canada. There's a point in this talk where I really turn to the work of the artist Camille Turner and the artist and writer Sylvia Hamilton, who I think are doing really interesting work that seeks to unearth and make this haunting much more present. But I'm not going to take you through all that. There's a way in which Canadian multicultural policy attempts to do an end round around this kind of haunting. But nonetheless, it always emerges. So you can turn to, say, the work of a figure like George Grant, um, who in his writing is always writing against Blackness in the US to mark out how Canada is different from the US. But again, when you read a George Grant, you can think of, the novel or her one novel, Mary Sarsfield's novel, or you can think of Oscar Peterson's body of work, or you can think of the Black Nova Scotian Carrie Bess's activism, or you can think of Austin Clarke's Toronto trilogy, and you begin to see how a certain kind of logic of Blackness is meant to be concealed by Canadian multicultural policy. I want to turn to something slightly different that often doesn't get, I think, accounted for in the Canadian context. And and I think I'll do that, and then I will conclude. I have a long section on the card fishery, but I'm going to cut that out and I'm going to conclude. So yeah, but let me go to this two sections here. I'll be. How much time do I have, Professor Tay?
Um, you've got 15 minutes,
Okay,
15
yeah, I can
minutes.
do it. Yeah,
Yeah. That's okay, right? Yeah.
yeah.
You can take a bit longer if you need.
Okay. So, two articles published in the Star Book News of the Guyana Diaspora column by the now UBC historian and cultural critic, the Black Canadian scholar Peter James Hudson, in which he's responding to, at the time, the 2008 two-year sponsorship of one of the largest carnivals in the world, the carnival once called Caribana, by Scotiabank, where Scotiabank sponsors the carnival for 250,000 Canadian dollars. In his critique, Hudson reminds us of the founding of Scotiabank, and he writes, Scotiabank has stated that their sponsorship of Caribana continues their long history of investment in the Caribbean, not in Canada, in the Caribbean. Founded in 1832 in Halifax as the Bank of Nova Scotia, the bank's profits initially came from the maritime trade in cod, sugar, molasses, and rum between Canada and the West Indies. In 1889, it opened its first offices in the region in Kingston and rapidly asserted itself as the British colony's most influential financial institution. Hudson goes on to document how in the bank's newsletters, it produced stereotypes of, quote, the majority of Jamaicans are born gamblers who are too lazy to work, end quote, and with at least one writer adding that, quote, the Jamaican Negro will not work as long as he has money, end quote. Hudson further points out that, quote, it took the bank close to a century to hire its first Jamaican-born general manager, prefer instead to give the administrative jobs to Canadian-born red, white staff, end quote. Hudson is writing of 1908 and 1938. However, by 2008, Scotiabank is sponsoring Caribana and having its name affixed to it in an effort to support what it now sees as Canadian diversity. Hudson has written extensively about U.S. banking in the Caribbean, and his deeply rich study of that history, found in Bankers and Empire, is largely silent on Canada. However, in the essay Imperial Designs, the Royal Bank of Canada in the Caribbean, which he published in 2010, he offers an account of how the Royal Bank expanded in the Caribbean as an element of the British Empire. In my previous engagement with Hudson's work, I have argued that he provides us the historical resource to make sense of how Canadian companies have been extractive companies in the Caribbean region. But more importantly, Hudson's studies of Canadian banking help us to make sense of and understand how Canada's colonial practices extend well beyond its borders. Hudson writes of the Royal Bank Archive that, quote, the near total restriction of public access to the bank's archives in suburban Toronto ensure it is a history that cannot be told in its entirety, end quote. Once we come to terms with this simple point, we can begin to more seriously account for how Blackness is constitutive of Canada's national imaginary. Hudson further states in recounting the colonial history of the Royal Bank into the 1970s, quote, the Royal Bank acted in the name of Canada. It also assumed a paternalistic, if admittedly second-tier role within the British Empire, providing the financial services and, in some cases, colonial monetary functions that would uphold an inter-imperial financial and commercial architecture, end quote. It is reckoning with this repressed national history and imaginary, one deeply and persistently haunted by Black people and Blackness, that might allow us to make a better sense of the contemporary antagonisms faced by Black people in colonial Canada and contemporary Canada, regardless of the size of our numbers. These histories reveal Canada's formation as centered in the slave-holding Atlantic world, plantations or not. It nonetheless inhabits the logics of its founding. I want to recount two moments from Hudson's article that are pertinent to my argument. First, Hudson writes of the British West Indies trade deals with Canada of 1912, 1920, and 1927. And he suggests that these deals were in part the groundwork for annexation, an idea that existed since the 1880s. Canada has always wanted to annex a Caribbean nation. Hudson points out, as we all know, annexation did not occur. He then quotes from Robin Winks, the historian who I mentioned earlier. Quote, the idea of Canada West Indian Union founded on three rocks of race. That is, the Canadian fear of Black West Indian migration, public indifference, and British opposition. End quote. Second, Hudson notes that in the era of structural adjustment in the global South, including the Caribbean, the Royal Bank withdrew from the region partially. But by 2007, with Canada under the leadership of Stephen Harper, the Royal Bank became, quote, the fourth largest bank in the region and the second largest bank after Scotiabank, another Canadian bank, in the Anglo-Caribbean, end quote. These 2 points taken together do not only provide an empirical index of ongoing and sustained extraction, they also provide evidence of the psychic life of Canada's national relations. Indeed, the perpetual winter fantasy of Canada owning a Caribbean island has a history to it. This is a kind of national parapraxis. Whiteness in Canada breaches its borders not only in banks' extraction of profits, but in how practices of whiteness as can frame narratives. Let me leave it there. What's most important for me in turning to these kinds of evidence is to set up some conditions, provocations, and cautions as Black studies unfolds in Canadian higher education. If Black studies is to do something more than other kinds of studies, it will have to do more than expand national concerns, fill in what is missing, add to what already exists, and so on. Black studies will have to undo and reconstruct the very terms of knowledge that makes Canada intelligible. It is this radical reordering of knowledge that will allow us to see that recent investments in things like Caribana, or at one point the banks were claiming that they were going to invest in Black youth and so on. And I think that in some ways this also has something that offered arguments around um, reparations. Okay, so I'll move toward the conclusion. So my last symptom as a way of concluding. Take for instance Harold Innis and his understanding of the modern Canadian economy. In Innis's work on the maritime fisheries, he's almost silent on slavery. In an otherwise careful accounting of the ways in which the fisheries industry became instrumental to formative moments of the distinctly modern Canadian economy, Innis's silence lends itself easily to the normative narrative of the nation and its modern fountain. But it's exactly the vexed place of Black diaspora people in modernity, and more specifically, the brutal ways in which their bodies and lives were the engines that forged and moved North Atlantic industrialization that remains an unresolved question in the Canadian nation state. Because the Canadian nation state begins with a diminished notion of slavery, and I'm being generous here, to Canada's modern formation, thinkers of NSA's caliber can bypass the significance of Canada's role in shipbuilding for slavery, the cod fisheries, and salted cod in particular, and thus all the myriad of ways that Canada's modern borders extended into slavery and are thus formed by New World transatlantic slave trade in African bodies. For thinkers like Innes, these are more than mere blind spots in their work. This is the evidence of national repression. Canadian histories reproduce a narrative of Canada as terminus for U.S. slavery and cannot adequately account for homegrown slavery in its inflections and benefits of its fantasy life of the white settler colony we inhabit. Innis's recounting of the maritime fisheries is one moment where an articulator of Canadian uniqueness provides a wholly inadequate accounting because of an inability to grapple with one of the formative elements that gave rise to the modern world, slavery. Fortunately, as Paul Gilroy has pointed out in the Black Atlantic, Innis is not alone as an articulator of the modern world who sees slavery as outside the boundaries of modernity. Excuse me. Maybe if a commentator as revered as Innes could account for Canada's benefits from slavery in its maritime studies, the cod eaten in the Caribbean, as represented in the bodies of actual Caribbean and Black people, would serve to constitute a firmer connection of Black diaspora and Caribbean people as not merely recent arrivals, but having a long and sustained link to both colonial and contemporary modern Canada. The point here is the histories of commodities and modern forms of governance and the ways in which they have changed the world are important because they illuminate in other ways that we are interconnected socially, culturally, politically, and economically. That our sports sensibilities allow for assessing the ways in which we haunt each other's cultural terrain, all the while having to recognize that the haunting is not the same all around. For example, the Scott Fisher is one of the best Canadian examples of his relationship to Blackness, the diaspora, and modernity more general. That's of the extension of Canada's geo-body beyond its geographical boundaries. It is critique that positions Canada inside the networks of global and diasporic problematics, and not as a benefactor of recent migrations, a curious observer on exceptionalist Western interlocutor. What I've been doing here through the trace of the historical, it's to set out a logic for reading Canada that refuses the terms of the frames that Canada has offered up for us to assess it and therefore analyze it. I'm calling this reading a symptomatic reading insofar I have been offering you multiple examples from the archive of Canada's place in the slave-generated and invented Atlantic world that are constitutive of the anti-Black rot that animates Canadian social, political, and its cultural imaginary, and therefore its national consciousness. Sylvia Winter, in On How We Mistook the Map for the Territory, in recounting the struggle for Black studies in the USA, argues that in its institutionalization and thus defeat, it was unable to, quote, complete intellectual that emancipation, end quote, that it had inaugurated. Winter argues and pointed out how liberal humanism and partial induction into what she calls the ethno-class of the West undermined and led to confusing the territory for the map. For example, Black studies became, she says, re-territorialized and ethnicizes African American studies, and what that meant was it became subordinated to the nation. We must ask ourselves, are we headed towards a similar ethnicized African Canadian studies? And if so, who will be its gatekeepers? And we've had some of these debates in the Canadian context before. I'm suggesting that EDI works and functions in a similar fashion as well to reterritorialize a more radical Black demands, while leaving the map still in the hands of the white bourgeois man as if human. a category that the Black can never enter, and it is the work of Black studies to destroy. So, alas, Black studies in contemporary Canada has its work cut out for it. Thank you.